Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that challenge assumptions and reveal powerful truths. Today's story centers around a moment of judgment that leads to a surprising discovery. It begins with an arrest, one that should never have happened. But what unfolds next shows how preconceived notions can cloud our vision and ultimately lead to unexpected outcomes. This is a tale of justice, identity, and the strength it takes to stand up against bias. Stay tuned for a journey you won't forget. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories like this, make sure to comment below and tell us where you're listening from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story from Hopeful Horizon. Officer Rick Matthews sighed as he sat in his squad car, watching the fading sun dip below the horizon. It was another quiet evening in the suburbs, the kind that lulled his attention. He'd been patrolling this same neighborhood for years and knew it like the back of his hand, a relatively affluent area, mostly free of serious crime. Yet, every now and then, something caught his eye that pulled him from the monotony of routine. That evening, it was a sleek black sedan parked in front of an upscale home that piqued his interest. It wasn't the car itself that seemed suspicious. It was the driver. Through the dimming light, Rick noticed a black woman, sharply dressed in business attire, but something about her presence made him uneasy. She wasn't from the neighborhood. His instincts, honed over years on the force, whispered that something was off. He turned the ignition and slowly pulled up behind the car. A quick check of the license plate revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No stolen vehicle report, no warrants, just a regular, well-maintained car. But Rick's suspicion lingered. He tapped the lights on and stepped out of his cruiser, straightening his uniform as he approached the driver's side of the sedan. "Ma'am," Rick began, knocking lightly on the window. The woman glanced up, her expression neutral but slightly irritated. She rolled down the window and raised an eyebrow. "Yes, officer." Her voice was calm, controlled. Rick took in her appearance, a crisp navy suit, a sleek leather briefcase in the passenger seat, and an air of confidence that made him hesitate. Still, he pressed forward. "May I ask what you're doing in this neighborhood?" The woman blinked, then frowned. "Excuse me?" "I asked what you're doing here. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I noticed your car parked here for a while." The woman exhaled slowly. "I'm parked in front of my friend's house, officer. I was making a phone call." Rick felt the tension rise. Something about her calm demeanor irked him, as though she were dismissing his authority. "I'm going to need to see your ID," he said, more firmly now. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she complied, reaching into her bag and pulling out her wallet. She handed him her driver's license with steady hands, her expression unreadable. As Rick studied the ID, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. The name on the license read, Alyssa Cole. No red flags came up when he ran her through the system. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at him. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle, Ms. Cole?" he asked, his tone edging into something more commanding. Alyssa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Is there a reason for that, officer? I need to make sure everything is in order." For a moment she sat still, her fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. Then, with a controlled sigh, she opened the door and stepped out. As Alyssa stood beside her car, Rick sized her up, trying to gauge if his gut instinct had led him astray. She stood tall and unbothered, her posture straight and unyielding, though her eyes showed the slightest flicker of irritation. He was used to people fidgeting, making excuses, or showing signs of nervousness during stops like these. But this woman, she was different. "Do you mind telling me what this is really about?" Alyssa asked, her voice low but steady. Rick crossed his arms. "I've been patrolling this neighborhood for years. I know everyone around here, and I don't think I've seen you before. It's my job to check up on things that don't look right." Alyssa's brow furrowed. "Does me sitting in my car, minding my own business, look wrong to you?" Rick felt the question land with weight. He could feel the discomfort growing in his chest, but instead of backing down, he pressed harder. "It's not about how it looks. It's about making sure this neighborhood stays safe." "Safe from what?" she shot back, a hint of incredulity in her voice. Before Rick could answer, a voice crackled over his radio. "Matthews, you good over there?" He hesitated before replying. Yeah, all good. He glanced back at Alyssa. Look, let's not make this harder than it has to be. I need to check your car. Alyssa crossed her arms now, her eyes narrowing. Check my car for what? Rick shifted uncomfortably, but his resolve didn't waver. Just a routine search, ma'am. It won't take long. The tension in the air thickened, but Alyssa remained calm, allowing the situation to unfold, knowing something Rick didn't. But for now, she'd let him proceed with his assumptions. Alyssa stood silently as Rick began his search. Her patience was wearing thin, but she stayed composed. She watched as he meticulously combed through the interior of her car, rifling through her briefcase and checking the glove compartment. The situation had shifted from routine to invasive, but Alyssa knew better than to protest yet. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered an overzealous officer. Rick found nothing suspicious. Her car was clean, the registration was up to date, and there wasn't a trace of anything illegal. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. You find what you're looking for, officer? Alyssa asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but had an edge now. Rick closed the door of the car, frustration flickering in his eyes. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Alyssa took a step forward, her eyes locking with his. Is this really about doing your job, or is it about something else? Rick stiffened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who seemed so sure of themselves. There was something in her gaze that unnerved him, but he wasn't about to admit it. Ms. Cole, I'm going to have to ask you to stay where you are, Rick said, pulling out his handcuffs. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. You're arresting me? Rick nodded. Until I can be sure everything's clear. Alyssa didn't resist, as Rick cuffed her hands behind her back, but her jaw tightened. You sure you want to do this, officer? Rick's face was set in determination. I'm just following protocol. With that, he guided Alyssa towards his squad car, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. She didn't fight back, didn't protest, but the way she looked at him made him question everything. There was a power in her silence, a quiet confidence that unnerved him. As Rick prepared to drive her to the station, he called in for backup, informing dispatch of the situation. Alyssa sat calmly in the back seat, her expression unreadable, but her mind was working fast. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. At the station, Rick walked Alyssa through the process, booking her for questioning, but something about the entire scene felt off. As they passed through the station, heads turned, and officers glanced at Alyssa with curious expressions. It wasn't the usual reaction to an arrest, and Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line he wasn't supposed to. As he led her to the interrogation room, a senior officer approached. Matthews, a word? Rick glanced at Alyssa, then back at his superior. Sure, Captain. What's up? The captain motioned for him to step aside, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Do you have any idea who she is? Rick blinked. Yeah, she's Alyssa Cole. I ran her ID. She's clean. The captain's eyes widened. Alyssa Cole? Do you even know who that is? Rick frowned, confused. I mean, I didn't find anything on her. She's an FBI agent, Matthews, the captain hissed. You just arrested a federal agent. Rick's stomach dropped. His face paled as the words sank in. FBI? No, there's no way. The captain nodded grimly. You're about to be in a lot of trouble if you don't fix this fast. She's been working undercover on a major case, and you just compromised everything. Rick's heart raced as the gravity of his mistake hit him. He had arrested an FBI agent without even realizing it. All of his suspicions, his assumptions, everything was wrong. He hurried back to the interrogation room where Alyssa sat calmly, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up at him with a steady gaze as he entered. I think it's time you and I had a conversation, she said, her voice cool but firm. Rick swallowed hard. You're an FBI agent? Alyssa nodded. That's right. I've been working on a case in this area, and your little arrest just put the entire operation at risk. Rick felt his throat tighten. I didn't know. No, you didn't, she said sharply, and that's exactly the problem. As the realization settled in, Rick's world felt like it was spinning out of control. He had made a colossal mistake, one that could cost him everything. His career, his reputation, and the respect of his peers were all hanging in the balance. Alyssa's calm demeanor only made it worse. She didn't need to yell or get angry. The weight of her position did all the talking. I'm sorry, Rick stammered. I didn't know. Alyssa shook her head slowly. You didn't even bother to ask, officer. You saw me sitting in a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and your first thought was that I didn't belong. Rick opened his mouth to protest, but found himself at a loss for words. Everything she said was true. He hadn't even considered that she might be anything other than what he assumed. I can't undo what's been done, Alyssa continued, her voice steady, but I can make sure this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else. Rick nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Alyssa studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. That depends. On you. Rick's heart raced as he awaited her judgment. He knew that his future was now in her hands. In the weeks that followed, Rick was suspended from duty pending an investigation. The story of his arrest spread quickly through the station and the community. He became the example of what not to do in police work, how prejudice and assumptions could lead to catastrophic mistakes. Alyssa, meanwhile, continued her work. The operation she had been leading wasn't compromised, but the incident with Rick had sparked a larger conversation within the community and the police department. Policies were revised, and training programs were put in place to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. For Rick, the hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. He had always considered himself a good cop, someone who did the right thing, but Alyssa had shown him just how much work he still had to do. One day, after months of reflection and a disciplinary hearing, Rick was given a second chance. He returned to duty, but this time, he carried with him the lessons he had learned. He vowed never to let his assumptions blind him again. As for Alyssa, she moved on from the case and never spoke of the incident again. But Rick knew that the impact she had on him would last a lifetime. She had shown him that true justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the people he was sworn to protect. And so, from a moment of misjudgment, both Rick and Alyssa walked away changed. This story is a reminder that even those with the best intentions can make mistakes, but it's how we learn from those mistakes that truly defines us. Thank you for joining us on Hopeful Horizon. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story filled with powerful lessons and surprising twists.